The first thing you noticed about the Dunmore land was the silence. Not the kind of silence that feels empty, the kind that feels full, like the land itself had been holding its breath for 100 years, waiting for something it hadn't named yet. The grass ran flat and gold all the way to the tree line, and the tree line ran straight as a promise along the eastern ridge. And if you stood at the fence post where the Dunmore property met the county road and looked west, you could see the Oklahoma sky doing what the Oklahoma sky did best, turning itself into something so wide and so blue it made your chest hurt a little just to look at it. Harriet Dunmore had grown up with that sky. She was 24 years old, and she had spent most of those years learning exactly how much sky a person could carry before the weight of it bent them sideways. Her father had died in March. Not sudden. He'd been sick since October. Sick in the way that old ranchers get sick, slow and stubborn, and pretending it wasn't happening until one morning it simply was. He left her the land, the 2 horses, a truck with a cracked windshield, and a fence line on the north side that had needed fixing for 3 years. He also left her a neighbor she barely knew. Franklin Edde was 57 years old. He had worked the Edde Ranch, his grandfather's land, his father's land, now his, for 31 of those years. He was the kind of man who showed up before he was asked and left before you thought to thank him. At the funeral, he had stood in the back of the church in a clean shirt that looked like it had been ironed by someone who meant it, and he had not said anything to Harriet except that he was sorry, and he had said it the way a man says something when he means exactly that, and nothing more. She had nodded. She had not thought about him again for 6 weeks. The fence came down in April. Not the whole thing, just the north section, where the post had been rotting since before Harriet's father got sick. A spring storm came through in the night, nothing dramatic, just enough wind and wet to finish what time had started, and in the morning Harriet walked out to find 40 feet of wire fence lying flat in the mud like it had just given up. She stood there in her boots, looking at it. She had fixed fence before. She knew how. But she was also trying to run the ranch alone for the first time in her life, and the list of things she needed to do before noon was already longer than she had hours for, and 40 feet of downed fence meant the horses could wander north onto Edde land, which meant she pressed her fingers against her forehead, which meant she needed to either fix it herself or call someone, and she didn't have the money to call someone, and she didn't have the time to do it herself. And she stood there in the mud, working through all of that arithmetic until she heard the sound of a truck coming up the county road. Franklin Edde pulled over without being called. He got out slowly, the way men who have spent 30 years on horseback tend to move, deliberate, unhurried, like the body has learned to conserve what it has. He was not a large man, but he was a solid one. His face was weathered in the particular way of men who work outside and don't think about it. He looked at the fence. He looked at her. Saw it come down last night, he said. I was just about to start on it, Harriet said, which was not entirely true. I've got posts in the truck, Franklin said. Already loaded. Figured you might. She looked at him. He looked at the fence. Neither of them said anything for a moment. You don't have to do that, she said. I know I don't, he said. He was already walking back to the truck. They fixed the fence that morning. Harriet worked alongside him, which she suspected surprised him a little, though he didn't show it. He handed her wire. She stretched it. He drove posts. She held the level. They didn't talk much. The kind of working silence that happens between people who know what they're doing and don't need to perform it for each other. Around 10 o'clock, she went back to the house and came out with 2 cups of coffee in the good mugs, the ones that weren't chipped, and she handed him one without asking how he took it, because she'd already seen him drink black coffee at the church reception, and she remembered things like that. He took the mug. He looked at it, then at her. Your father made good coffee, he said. His was better, she said. That was the whole conversation. But something in it landed differently than she expected. Over the next 2 months, Franklin Edde helped her in the way that good neighbors help. Not constantly, not with fanfare, but reliably. The kind of help that shows up so quietly, you almost don't notice it until you do. He sent his hired hand over with a load of hay when her delivery fell through in May. He mentioned, offhand at the feed store one Saturday, that the water pump on the south well sometimes ran rough in heat, and that if she poured a cup of white vinegar down the line, it would clear the mineral buildup. Advice that she tried the next morning, and that worked. He did not make a big thing of any of it. He did not expect anything back. What Franklin Edde did not do in those 2 months was look at Harriet Dunmore the way a man looks at a woman when he's thinking something. Except that sometimes, very briefly, he did. She noticed. She filed it away under the category of things she was not going to think about because she had enough to think about. The complication arrived in June. His name was Tanner Quillen, 28 years old, newly arrived in the county, the nephew of someone who owned 300 acres he wasn't working, which meant he had money and time in about equal measure. He drove a truck that was too clean for someone who claimed to be a rancher. He had the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having had to figure anything out the hard way. He started coming around. The first time was a Sunday afternoon, and he arrived with a bag of groceries he said he'd picked up in town since he was passing by anyway, which Harriet could tell was not true since the grocery store was 12 miles in the opposite direction of her property from where he would have been coming from. She thanked him. She put away the groceries. She said she had things to do. He came back the following Friday, then the Thursday after that. He was not unpleasant. He was not rude. He was, in fact, perfectly nice in the particular way of men who have learned that being perfectly nice is usually enough to get them what they want. He talked about the land, her father's land, how valuable it was becoming with the new county road coming through. He talked about his uncle's property. He talked, once, about what a young woman managing a ranch alone must find difficult, and Harriet smiled very pleasantly and suggested he might be surprised. And he laughed in a way that meant he thought she was joking. She was not joking. Franklin, the second time he showed up at the property on the same afternoon as Tanner, said nothing about it. He came to drop off a piece of equipment he'd borrowed. A post driver returned cleaner than he'd taken it, and he nodded to Tanner, nodded to Harriet, set down the equipment, and left. It took him maybe 90 seconds, but Harriet saw the way Tanner watched him go. "Old Ed," Tanner said, after the truck had pulled back onto the county road, "he's been sniffing around your property since your dad passed, hasn't he?" The word sniffing landed wrong. She didn't say so. "He's been a good neighbor," she said. "I'm sure he has," Tanner said, and smiled. "Now, I want to stop here for just a moment and speak to you directly, because this is the part of the story where things could go any number of ways. If you've ever watched someone make the wrong choice and wanted to reach through the screen and shake them, you'll understand what it is to be a neighbor watching this from a distance. And if you've ever been the person standing there, trying to hear your own judgment over the noise of everyone else's opinions, you'll understand exactly where Harriet Dunmore was standing that summer afternoon. Before we go further, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop your state, your country, your little corner of this earth in the comments below. And if this story is settling into your chest the way a good story should, tap that like button and make sure you're subscribed to Prairie Hearts. Every one of you, thank you for being here. Now let's get back to Harriet. It was July when things clarified. Tanner asked Harriet to dinner. Formally, with some effort, standing in her driveway on a Tuesday evening, when the light was doing something flattering to everything it touched. He said he knew a place in the next town, good steaks, good wine. He said she deserved a night that wasn't about fence posts and feed schedules. He said it like he'd rehearsed it, which she thought he probably had. She told him she needed to think about it. She spent 2 days thinking about it and arrived at the answer that had probably been there from the start. She did not want to go to dinner with Tanner Quillen. Not because he had done anything wrong, not because he was unkind, but because being with him felt like something she would have to manage, like a horse that was pleasant on a good day, but that you never quite fully trusted. And Harriet Dunmore did not have the energy to manage anyone. She told him no on Thursday morning, as kindly as she could, which she thought she managed reasonably well. He took it less reasonably, which is to say he said some things about her age and her situation and how she might want to reconsider what her options were. And she listened to all of it, with her face very still and her hands very calm. And then she said, "I think I know my own options. Thanks for stopping by," and walked back inside. She stood in the kitchen for a long time afterward. Then she picked up her gloves and went back out to the barn because there was a mare with a sore hock that needed attention, and the sore hock did not care about Tanner Quillen's opinions. It was Franklin who found out, not because she told him, but because this was a county of 1,200 people, and news traveled at the speed of coffee. He came by on a Saturday morning, ostensibly about a piece of equipment she'd mentioned needing, but she suspected even before he got out of the truck that the equipment was a secondary concern. He was carrying it anyway. He set it down. He looked at her for a moment. "Heard Quillen was out this way," he said. "He was," she said. "Everything all right?" "Fine," she said. He nodded, looked at the barn, looked back at her. "You know," he said, "your father had a theory about people. He said you could tell a man's character by what he did with his hands when he wasn't sure what to do." She waited. "Quillen keeps his hands in his pockets," Franklin said. She laughed. It surprised her, not the laugh itself, but the place it came from, something loosening in her chest that had been tightened all summer. "That's my father's voice coming out of your mouth," she said. "He was a smart man," Franklin said. "Smarter than most people gave him credit for." They were quiet for a moment. The mare shifted in the barn, and the sound of it, the comfortable animal weight of the morning, settled around them. "He talked about you, you know," Harriet said, and then felt immediately uncertain whether she should have said it. "My father?" He said Franklin Edde was the best neighbor in 3 counties and that he was too quiet about it. Franklin looked at her for a long moment. "Your father was generous," he said. "He meant it," she said. "He wasn't a generous man with compliments." "I know," Franklin said. "I know he wasn't." Something passed between them that she didn't have a name for. She named it later, alone in the kitchen after he'd gone, standing at the window with a cold cup of coffee in her hand and the evening light coming down across the pasture. She named it slowly, the way you name something you've been looking at for a long time before you let yourself see it. She had 2 feelings, and they were both uncomfortable. The first was that she trusted Franklin Edde in a way that was different from how you trust a good neighbor. The kind of trust that wasn't about competence or reliability, but about character. The bone-deep kind, the kind that was more dangerous. The second was that she did not know what to do with that. He was 57 years old. She was 24. The arithmetic was, she stopped herself, because she could hear the word arithmetic in her head in a voice that wasn't quite her father's and wasn't quite her own. And she didn't want to follow that thread right now. She set down her coffee. She went to bed. August came in slow and enormous the way August does in Oklahoma, and the ranch demanded everything she had, and she gave it everything. And Franklin continued to be exactly who he was, present without being intrusive, helpful without being presumptuous, and almost completely unreadable in the specific way that was starting to drive her quietly insane. It was the harvest supper at the Aldine family's place that changed things. The whole county came, as it always did. The kind of gathering that isn't about the food, though the food was remarkable, but about the ritual of seeing who was still standing after another summer. Tables in the yard, lanterns strung between the fence posts, someone playing fiddle badly, and then someone else taking over and playing it right. Harriet arrived alone. She found herself standing at the edge of the food table, loading a plate, when Mrs. Aldine, 71 years old, the kind of woman who knew everything about everyone and deployed that knowledge with surgical precision, appeared at her elbow. "Franklin Edde's been watching you for 15 minutes, Mrs. Aldine said pleasantly, as though commenting on the weather. Harriet did not turn around. "Has he?" she said. "He has. He's also been standing near the fence rather than sitting down, which means he's trying to talk himself into something." Mrs. Aldine selected a piece of cornbread. "In case you were wondering." "I wasn't," Harriet said, which was a lie, and they both knew it. She turned around eventually. Not because of Mrs. Aldine, she told herself. Because the fiddle player had switched songs, and it was one she liked, and she turned around to see who was playing. Franklin was standing near the fence. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the fiddle player. But when she turned, he felt it somehow, the way people sometimes do, and he looked over, and for a moment they were just looking at each other across a yard full of people in the August dark, and the lantern light was doing something to the evening, and Harriet thought very clearly. Oh, she walked over. "Mrs. Aldine told me you've been standing over here for 15 minutes, she said. He looked down at the ground very briefly, then back at her. "I was working up to something," he said. "What were you working up to?" He was quiet, in the way he was often quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was making sure he said the right thing. "I've been trying to figure out," he said, "whether it's right to say anything." She waited. "You're 24 years old," he said. "I'm 57. That's a lot of arithmetic. I know how old we both are," she said. "I'm aware you know." He looked at her. "I just want to be sure I'm not. I don't want to put you in a position. I have no interest in making anything difficult for you." "Franklin," she said. "Yes. What were you going to say?" He took a breath. The fiddle played something that swooped and resolved, the way the best songs do. "That I look forward to Saturdays," he said, "in a way I haven't looked forward to something in a very long time. And that I'm not sure what to do about that except tell you." She looked at him for a long time. "That's all," she said. "That's everything," he said. She turned to look out at the field. The dark had come all the way down now, and the lanterns made the yard into a small warm world separate from everything else. "My father trusted you," she said, "more than almost anyone." "I know," Franklin said. "I've been thinking about why," she said. "What makes a person that kind of trustworthy? And I keep coming back to the same thing." She paused. "It's not about what you say. It's about what you show up for, over and over, without being asked." He didn't say anything. "The fence," she said, "the hay, the water pump. The post driver returned clean." She looked at him. "You could have let all of that be someone else's problem. You chose not to." "Anyone would have," he said. "No," she said. "They wouldn't." The fiddle finished. Someone started clapping. In the brief quiet between songs, Franklin Edde did something she had not expected. He said, "Would you want to go for a ride sometime? Just out on the property. No particular purpose, just to go." It was a small question, the smallest possible kind. She said yes. The ride was the following Sunday, 2 hours in the early morning before the heat came down, out along the ridge where the Dunmore land butted up against Eddy land in a border that had never been contentious because the men on either side had always had the sense to respect it. The horses moved easy in the cool air. They talked about her father, about the land, about nothing in particular, about the way the grass came up different in the years when the rain was late. Franklin told her a story about her father from before she was born. Something funny involving a stuck truck and a county official and a very large and uncooperative pig. And she laughed harder than she had laughed since March, maybe longer. Riding back, she said, "How long ago did you lose your wife?" He was quiet for a moment. 11 years, he said. "Do you miss her?" "Every day," he said. "Less sharp now, but every day." She nodded. "That's what I want," she said. "Whatever I build, I want it to be something a person would miss every day. Not just sometimes." "That's a high standard," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her, and she thought she saw something shift in his face. Not dramatically, just a settling. The way a door sounds when it fits perfectly into its frame. They did not call it courting. Neither of them used that word, which perhaps was why it was exactly what it was. He came to dinner twice in September. She came to fix a gate on his property in October, and stayed for coffee, and then stayed for supper, and then drove home in the dark with the truck windows down, and the October air smelling of cut grass and whatever else October smells like when something is beginning. He was 57, and she was 24, and the 33 years between them were real, and she did not pretend otherwise. There were conversations that needed having about what each of them wanted, about the land, about children, about the particular shape of a future built across a generational gap. They had those conversations. They were not easy, but they were honest, which is the more important thing. On a December evening, sitting on her porch with mugs of coffee that had gone cold because they'd been talking too long to remember to drink them, Franklin Edde said, "I want to ask you something I don't entirely know how to ask." "Try," she said. "I want to know," he said slowly, "whether you would want to make something of this. Something real. Not just being neighbors who take rides." She looked out at the field. The winter dark had come in fully, and the stars were out in the way they got in December in Oklahoma, sharp and specific, like someone had placed them there deliberately. "I've been afraid," she said, "of the arithmetic." "I know," he said. "Not afraid of you. Afraid of what people will think, what it looks like, what it means in 20 years when you're—" She stopped. "77, he said quietly. "And you'll be 44. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I won't ask you to choose something that costs more than you're willing to pay," he said. "That's not something I'm entitled to. You're 24 years old, Harriet. You have every right to want a future that looks conventional, easy. I'm not an easy choice." "No," she said. "You're not." She turned the cold mug in her hands. "But easy wasn't what my father raised me for," she said. She said yes. They were married the following April, on the Dunmore land, in the same field where the fence had come down in the storm a year earlier, and a quiet man had pulled over with posts already loaded in the truck. The ceremony was small. Neighbors, a few relatives, the woman from the feed store who had known Harriet since she was 7, Mrs. Aldine in a hat that was considerably more elaborate than the occasion technically required. At some point during the reception, Mrs. Aldine found her way to Franklin and said something to him that Harriet couldn't hear. Whatever it was made him laugh, a full, real laugh that she hadn't heard from him before, and that she thought she would spend the rest of her life trying to hear again. She asked him later what Mrs. Aldine had said. He shook his head. "She said I should have worked up the nerve in June instead of August, and that I cost her a summer's worth of suspense." Harriet laughed. "She wasn't wrong," she said. They worked the land together, hers and his, which slowly stopped being hers and his, and became something that didn't need a possessive pronoun anymore. She turned 25, then 26, then 28. He turned 58, then 59, then 60, which he minded and she did not. They had 2 children, a daughter and then a son, who grew up knowing that the land they lived on had started with a fence post and a cold morning and a man who showed up before he was asked. The children grew. The land held. The arithmetic that had seemed so enormous, 33 years, 57 and 24, turned out to be less important than the other arithmetic. The one that counted how many mornings you chose to wake up and do this again, together, how many times you showed up without being asked, how many cold cups of coffee you let go cold because something more important was happening. That arithmetic never stopped mattering, and that is where I'll leave Franklin Edde and Harriet Dunmore, on that December porch with cold coffee and a sky full of Oklahoma stars, at the exact moment when she said yes, because that is the moment that matters. Everything else that came after was just the long and ordinary and extraordinary proof of what they both already knew. If you're the kind of person who wonders whether the arithmetic is too much, whether the years are too many, whether the distance is too wide, whether it's already too late, I hope this story gave you a moment's pause. Not every calculation comes out the way you expect it to. Some of the most important numbers in a life turn out to be smaller than you feared. To everyone listening tonight, wherever you are in this wide and complicated world, from Oklahoma to South Africa, from Michigan to New Zealand, from the prairie to the coast, thank you for spending this time here. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Like this video and share it with someone who needs a reminder that good things still happen to people who show up. God bless every one of you. Keep riding.